Okay, so the topic of today's lecture is RBAC. Okay, RBAC means Role-Based Access Control Policy. RBAC, Role-Based Access Control Policy. And there are a couple of important topics within the RBAC framework, right? RBAC, Role-Based Access Control Policy framework, right? And basically, the core RBAC means that basically they introduce the concept of the role activation as a part of the user's session within the computer systems. And what is really what are the components in RBAC? Basically the intro part, right? The core RBAC, right? And basically in my lecture today, right? In today's lecture, I'm going to talk only about the core RBAC, okay? And then probably the next important topic is role hierarchy, right? So the topic is hierarchical RBAC. And another important topic is the separation of duty. Okay, the separation of duty, right? But in today's lecture, right, my focus is on core RBAC. Okay, so now let's talk about the RBAC, right? Okay, let's talk about RBAC. The RBAC, right? It's commonly used in the database, a lot of data management systems, and many the security management system also use RBAC as their main access control policy model. Okay, so this is like one example, right? Why the RBAC is so popular, right? And RBAC is probably the policy, right? Security policy that have been most researched, right? It's has been and still is a very, very popular research topic, right? Okay, now, so let's look at the non-role-based systems, and then you have users and permissions, right? Permission you can think as consists of two elements. The operation and object, right? So for example, read object 1 and write object 2, right? So the permission is a pair of what? The operation and object, right? So now, let's say Alice, right, is able to, for example, to read and write to this DB account, right? And Alice also just can read WebSphere account and etc., right? So we have 5 users, and we have 4 object, right? So basically, how many lines? 5 times 4, we have 20 lines, right? But even with this toy example, right, we have 20 lines to manage, right? So 5 times 4 is 20. Assuming that we have millions of users, right? The complexity, then it's going to be quickly becomes exponential, right? And it's really hard to manage, right? Whereas, let's look at this role-based access control policy. So you see that there is something called role between the users and permissions, right? When you look at the roles, you can have a DB database admin roles, and then you have a web admin roles, and then software developer role, right? And now, instead, you connect users to the permission directly, right? You're gonna basically, user will be assigned to a specific role. For example, Alice is assigned to specific role as, let's say, her role is a DB, and at the same time, her role is web admin, right? And then let's look at the Carl. Right? His role is what? Is the web admin, right? And at the same time, he is also a software developer, right? So Carl has 2 roles. Now, the next step is, if you look at the association between the roles and the permissions, the DB is what? The DB, right? This role is, for example, can read and write to the DB account and also to the Linux account, right? As a web admin, by the way, this is not a user, right? This is a role, right? If the user has a role as a web admin, then that user can access to the WebSphere and the Linux account, right? So compare these two systems. As you can see, the role-based access control policy is, for example, right? By just using this, let's just look at this two example. How many lines? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. So it's much less lines to manage, first of all. And this is much more manageable, right? So first thing we need to do as a, let's say as a system architect, security system architect, you don't really worry about the users, right? At the very beginning, you just design or architect the role, right? And then think about the permissions, right? Which are going to be associated with the roles, right? So now, let's say you add more users, right? Your only concern is now what? Assign each user to right, to a specific roles, right? So this RBAC is much more manageable and it's scalable, right? Compared to non-role based system. Okay, so this is like this diagram really shows the motivation behind the RBAC. Okay, so for example, you know that you have individuals, right? Individuals assigned to roles, and then right, this is okay. This is something called between the individual and roles. You see a association, right? This is something called the user associations. Okay, and between the role and permissions, right? This is permission association. Okay, between the role and resource. Okay, now, and you know that the left side is something called role hierarchy, right? We're not going to talk about this role hierarchy in this lecture, right? But you know, the idea is very simple. Like you have a manager, underneath the manager you have a senior admin, right, and etc. Right? On the bottom you have an employee, right? And obviously the manager will have more accesses, right, compared to the just regular employee. Okay. Anyway, if you look at the right diagram, right one, it really shows the motivation, right? Without the role, you have n multiply m assignments. Basically, it's much more complex and it's very hard to manage. Whereas if you have a role, you see the management has become much more simple, right? It's more, it's really like manageable and scalable. Okay, and okay, so this is the most important, probably slide in this lecture. Is really important diagram, right? Because it really shows the main components of the RBAC. Okay, so now let's talk about this diagram. Okay, a little bit. Okay, so hold on. Okay, so now let's talk about this diagram, right? Role-based access control policy. Let me just draw the couple of. Let me just draw this diagram because it's so important, right? So we have user, right? And then we have roles, right? And then we have sessions. And then we have what? We have permissions. Okay, so you see that there are four main components in RBAC. Okay, this is RBAC, right? Okay, the users, right? And then there is some association between the users and the roles, right? And this is called the user assignment, UA. User assignment. This association is called the user assignment. And this association between the roles and the permissions, this is called the PA, permission assignment. Okay. And then there is there's a relationship between the users and the sessions, right? And then there is a relationship between the session and role. Okay. And by the way, I want you to pay attention to the arrow. So this is there are two arrows, right? Two directional. and there's a two directional, right? But this one has only one directions, right? Okay, so this two direction means it's many to many. Okay, so if this means many to many, and this means what? One to many. So for example, the use between the users, oops, the handwriting is okay. So between the users and roles, right? This is like a many-to-many relationship. Okay, this is what? This is a many-to-many relationship. So for example, if you go to this direction, right? The one user can have many roles, right? And if you go to these directions, one role can have many users, right? So this is like many-to-many relationship. And this is like also the many-to-many. One role can have many permissions, right? And each permission can be associated with the multiple roles, right? And okay, so this is like and then this is what? This is many to many, and this is what? One to many. Okay, so I'll talk about the session a little bit. Okay, so first I want to talk about the permissions, then I'm going to talk about sessions. Okay, if you look at the permission, right? There are two main elements in the permissions. One is what? Operations, ops, and object, obj, the object, right? So this is like a permissions. So example of the permissions, as you can see, is a pair, right? So for example, read and write to the object, let's say object 1, right? Another example is just execute to object 2, right? So these are the permissions. As you can see, permissions is a pair of operation and object. Okay, so that's the permissions. So for now, we see that there's a 4 main components in RBAC, right? The permissions. Okay. Now let's talk about the sessions. The sessions is you know that okay by looking at this diagram, you know the user is associated with the session, right? So basically, the main role of this, main idea of like, you know, when the first RBAC is created, I think the researchers create a concept of session to explain, you know, a couple of more concepts such as the role hierarchy and separation of duties, and etc. Right? But right now, you can think as like a, you know, the session is needed in order for the user to be activated, right? So, for example, when the user's access to a system, right, through the sessions, and then at that time, right, user can be activated by having a specific role, right, through the session, okay? So, for example, the user is logged into a system through a session. So this is like a concept. And then at that time, the session will assign a specific role to that user. So at that time, the user will be activated to have the specific roles. Okay. So you know that it's one user can have multiple sessions. So I mean, by the way, this is like my way of interpreting the sessions. It's not in the textbook or not in the slide, but you know, let's say you can think the session as a pipeline, right? And then there's a user, right? User let's say get into the session, and then the session will provide, let's say, a specific role. For example, like Blackboard, right? We have so many roles in Blackboard, right? So roles, like we have instructor roles, and then we have a student role, right? And then TA, and then guest, and then etc. Right? So we have multiple roles. So when let's say when I log into the Blackboard, right, through the session will activate me and then assign a instructor role, right, to me, right? So then I can have all those permissions, right, for the instructor role, right? Okay. So, but you see that it's each session, right? User can have multiple sessions. Right? So this is a one-to-one. So each user can have multiple sessions, right? But each session can have only one user, right? So let's say this is session number 1, and then let's say this is session number 2, right? And each session can have only one user at the time, right? So that's what that means, one to many, right? Okay. So yeah, I think I'm like maybe I can give you one more example. Let's say student, right? Let's say Kevin is a student, right? And then Kevin is logged into the Blackboard system, right, through the sessions, right? So there's a session will be created, and then the Kevin as a student, right? Let's say Kevin is predefined and his role is a student, right? So Kevin's logged into a system through these sessions, and the Kevin will be activated by this session, and then what? Right now her role is, his role is what? Student, right? Right? Then once you log into the system, you will be, the Kevin will can do the following operation, because for example, for the student, right? For the student role, by the way, just this is the example. The permissions given to the students is, for example, read what content area, right? And they read announcement board, and etc. Right? So these there are there are basically many more, but these are the let's say permissions, set of permissions given to what? Student role, right? So when the Kevin is logged in through this session, and session will assign the student role to the Kevin, and of course the Kevin is able to what? Perform the following operations, right? Defined in the set of permissions. Okay, so basically that's the main the concept in RBAC. I think there are a couple of more slides that I would like to go over. Okay, so basically they're talking about terms and definition. I want you to read, right? And okay, so that's the one that, so they talk about object, operation, permissions, and role and user, right? I already explained this. Okay, now, so basically this is summary. The user has access to the object based on the assigned role, right? And the roles are defined based on the job functions, and permissions are defined based on the job authority and responsibilities within our job functions, right? And operations, so basically the important thing is roles are defined on the job functions, right? So that's how people usually define roles, right? Based on the job function, right? Okay, and then object is concerned with the user's role. So this is not very important. The object is concerned with the user role, not the user, right? You know that it's object, right? This object is concerned with the roles, right? It's not the user, right? So that's like the core concept of RBAC, right? Okay, and then the privilege. The roles are engineered based on the principle of the least privilege. This is common sense. So basically, the main idea is what? Oh, this one. The user is assigned to a role that allow him or her to perform only what is required for that role. So this is like the core concept of what? The least privilege, right? Okay. And this is the mathematical definition of the RBAC, but you don't have to really worry about it. Okay, so basically I'm done with the my lecture today. Basically this in this lecture I talk about the core, right? The core concept of RBAC. As I show you, where is it? Right. So basically, today I talk about what? The core RBAC, right? So what are the concepts of the RBAC, and like for example, what the main components are, right? Okay. So I'm done. I'll see you next time. Bye.